Hi there, John Wilkinson on the History Made Easier channel. A lot of criticism has been dished out at the generals of World War One. Lions led by donkeys is the great British accusation against General Haig. But recent historians have given General Haig and other generals a bit of a comeback, a bit of a revision. One historian, if you can see the book here, Gary Sheffield, A Short History of the First World War. Another historian, Peter Hart and the Great War. Both of these historians give a much more balanced view of how the generals learnt and how the generals adapted their tactics and how those tactics became more effective. I've got an ebook coming out somewhere before Christmas on World War One. And I'm going to give you 3 short extracts, I hope, that show how generals were in fact learning, and learning well. Their tactics became much more sophisticated than you might realise. The first general I'm going to look at is General Brusilov and the Brusilov offensive in June 1916. Let me read you a little bit from my book. The Brusilov offensive was launched on a 500-kilometre front on June the 4th, 1916. Its aim was to push the Austro-Hungarians back into Galicia, and it was initially a tremendous success. General Brusilov was Russia's most astute general, and in the offensive, given his name, took lessons learned from the Western Front, plus ideas of his own. It began, the offensive, with a massive bombardment along the huge front, using almost 2,000 guns. Like Joffre and Haig, he was convinced that this would not only confuse the enemy as to where the brunt of the attack would take place, but would allow for multiple breakthroughs whilst not allowing the enemy the chance to fire at his flanks. So, by dispensing with the tactic of concentrating on a small section of the enemy's defences, which had been the case before, he didn't give the enemy the advantage of being able to concentrate its manpower as well as its artillery. He also sent out signals intending to be intercepted, so as to mislead the enemy. He made diversionary troop movements too, so as to add to their confusion. And he made his bombardment relatively short, so as to give them no time to prepare. Trenches were prepared to jut out towards the enemy lines to get his men as close as possible before going over the top. He also held his reserves close to the front line, but sheltered out of sight in prepared dugouts, so that they would be ready to support a faltering attack or else force through a breakthrough. He carefully trained and prepared both his gunners and his infantry, using reconnaissance photographs and scale models of the enemy's lines. And his coordination between artillery and infantry was unprecedented, with each gun battery assigned a specific task. As well as the bombardment with field guns focused on the barbed wire and the heavier guns on the Austro-Hungarian defences, they were also directed to fire at command posts and road networks, so as to disrupt the enemy's command and communication systems. What is more, he had the bombardment stop after 3 hours and then resume, stop and resume again, so as to further confuse the enemy. He also dispensed with cavalry, as he felt it was useless in the face of bombardments and the machine gun. His infantry attacked in 4 waves, the first carrying hand grenades as well as their rifles would take the first line of trenches. The second, also with hand grenades, would push on to the second line of trenches. The third and fourth waves would consolidate the gains, bringing up their machine guns in order to do so, whilst all the time looking to smash through further. I think you would agree that is a lot more sophisticated than what we might be led to believe. Lessons had been learnt. It was a success. The offensive was a success. It ultimately failed because the Russians didn't provide adequate backup to make sure that offensive could hold. And the Germans came round to prop up the Austro-Hungarians. But now I'm going to take you to the spring of 1918 and the German spring offensive, Ludendorff's offensive. Have a listen to this. Ludendorff had carefully planned the attack and had prepared thoroughly. There would be an horrific hurricane barrage targeting headquarters, the artillery units, as well as the frontline trenches, with more than 6,500 guns, as well as more than 3,500 heavy trench mortars. German air reconnaissance had done their job in mapping the targets. He had turned a third of his cavalry into foot soldiers and had created and trained special storm battalions to advance quickly and find the weakest points in the enemy's line before sending in the mass of his troops. There would be no preliminary bombardment, and the troops were brought up to the line secretly at night. The preliminary phase, a series of massive artillery bombardments along much of the Western Front so as to disguise where they intended to attack, began on March the 9th. It included 500,000 mustard gas and phosgene gas shells, tear gas too, 900,000 kilograms of gas in total. Then the Germans launched their major assault on March the 21st, beginning with a hurricane bombardment with more of the same gases. The Germans attacked with everything they had: artillery, strafing, and aerial bombardment. Their first troops attacked halfway through the opening barrage, using lightweight submachine guns. The British were pushed back more than 60 kilometres, but desperately they held on. So again, you see a much more planned, a much more coordinated attack with aircraft being used, strafing and bombarding. More sophisticated, again, I think, than perhaps you've been led to believe. Okay, I'm going to end with the British. Well, that's a bit biased. I'm going to end with the Entente powers and the Americans. This is really the push that won the war, fighting back from Ludendorff's spring offensive. On August the 8th, the British, plus Australians and Canadians, supported by the French and the Americans, now attacked the Germans in what came to be known as all-arms battle. That was the tactic, all-arms battle. the culmination of what the British and French had been learning in 3 years of bitter fighting on the Western Front. It was the integration of all the new weaponry so that the Germans were hit with firepower more than manpower. The artillery had almost 1,400 field guns and howitzers available, plus some 700 heavy artillery pieces. Thanks to the RAF and flash spotters and sound rangers, these were guys who looked at where the flashes of the German guns were coming from, or the sounds of the German guns were coming from, and directed the British artillery to fire on them. The British gunners knew where just about every German gun was placed, and after 3 years' experience, they were very accurate. There were also enough guns for both a barrage aimed at the German guns as well as a creeping barrage to cover the initial attack. Infantry and more than 300 tanks attacked behind the creeping barrage. The tanks were used to crush the barbed wire and to take out any surviving German strongpoints. The infantry carried, as well as their rifles, light machine guns, mortars and rifle grenades, and were covered by heavy machine gun fire, and they no longer advanced in lines, but in small groups of about 8 men. This was all supported from the air as planes strafed the German defences, bombed supply routes and airfields, and reported back on the progress of the attack. Whilst behind the advance, another 120 tanks brought up supplies. This was the push that led to Germany seeking its armistice. Now, I know the argument remains that millions of lives had been sacrificed in order for these lessons to be learned. It took 2 years before the Brusilov offensive, and it took 18 years before the German, it took 4 years, 1918, for the German and British offensives to apply everything that had been learned. That's a fair argument, but the counter-argument is that bits of these lessons were being applied throughout those 4 years. And these generals were fighting the first war of its kind, an industrialised war, with tanks and aeroplanes. And they needed to learn lessons in order to use them to the best effect. So I think I've presented an argument here for you that redresses the balance or the weight of arguments that criticise the generals of World War I. And in that, I think it would be a useful exercise for you. So as always, thank you for listening. And as always, do check out my History Made Easier website. Cheers.